Each and every day, God provides everything that we need to live. Even in our deaths, all we have belongs to God. In life and in death, we would do well to live like the two women whose stories we hear today, as if we know that everything comes from God. I had a small coincidence this week when I went to Asbury Methodist Village, where some of our retired folks live, where they gather for communion once a month. I looked around the table and realized that we had exactly the same number of chairs as we had people who were coming that day. Remarkably, I remembered back to the past 2 times that I've been there with them several months ago, and we had the exact right number of chairs on those days too. I said to them, does this happen every day when you gather? And they said, no, of course not. Sometimes we have just a few people and too many chairs, and sometimes we have to bring in chairs from the edge of the room. But I just delight in small coincidences like that. And so I was just thrilled to see that there were exactly enough chairs. Someone around the table mentioned that it was like the Jewish holiday of Hanukkah. The Maccabees come and reclaim the temple and go to rededicate it, and they realize that all of the oil has been profaned, except for one small jar, one still sealed by the high priest, that they could use to light the menorah. And so they light the menorah knowing that the oil will only last one day, and it will take 8 days for them to make new oil. But the end of the first day comes, and the menorah is still burning. The second day, the third day, the fourth day, the fifth day, the sixth day, the seventh day, and finally on the 8th day, when the new oil is ready, the menorah is still burning. That's why it's called the Festival of Lights, Hanukkah. Mary Jo said that she had seen this cartoon. The cell phone only had enough battery power to last for 1 day, but it lasted 8 days. The miracle of Hanukkah updated. It's as if you've lost your charger, left it at a friend's house, and it's going to take 8 days to get there by mail. And finally, at the 8th day, even after surfing the web, using it for directions, all those high-power things we do now, it's still on. We could have talked, though, not about the miracle of Hanukkah or the miracle of the cell phone, but the miracle of the woman of Zarephath. This woman is a widow. Apparently, she didn't have anyone who was capable of fulfilling their duties to take care of her. She was all alone. She had gone through all of her stores, looked in her cabinets, searched her house, looked in her purse, and found nothing left. Just enough meal to make a small cake for herself and her son. She realizes that she's very close to death. It's as if she's received this message on her cell phone screen. Don't forget. You're going to die. This was on the front of the Christian Century, a publication that I get every month. And when it arrived in my mail, I almost had to set it on the table and step back. For some reason, we all know we're going to die. But when I saw it so boldly like that on a cell phone that we look at all of the time, it hit me. This, I think, is what's really important about the Christian story that we gather to hear each and every week. God reminds us again and again that even in the face of death, we have this true promise of life eternal, everlasting, forever. But this unnamed widow of Zarephath, she hadn't heard this promise yet. She believes that both she and her son will surely perish forever. And here she stands facing Elijah, a man she's never met, who she likely hasn't even heard of, who's asking her for her last bit of bread. She hasn't heard of Elijah, but Elijah has heard of her. Do you remember what Elijah heard? Liam read it for us this morning. He read, "The Lord says to Elijah, 'Go now to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and live there, for I have commanded a widow to feed you." This request doesn't come from Elijah himself, but it comes from this widow. Notice how similar these two stories of these two women are that we read this morning. At first glance, we could think that Elijah is being coercive. I heard a definition of leadership recently that says a leader is one who influences the behavior of others without coercion or force. When we read these verses out of context, it's tempting to see Elijah's radical request as coercive. He's a prophet, she's just a poor widow. He's coming to her for this food in her most desperate moment. But when we keep it in context and look back just a few verses earlier, we hear that Elijah and the whole land was in a drought. Elijah wasn't taking advantage of her or looking just for a snack, but rather he's been relying on the Lord to live on just what the ravens bring to him, trickles of water from the rocks. And even that has dried up. And so in this moment of desperation, Elijah listens to the Lord. He wasn't asking the widow to do anything that he hadn't already done himself. He's leading her together in this radical trust in God. And in that moment of trust when everything seems lost, God provides all that's needed until the famine ends. The next part of this story isn't included in our reading this morning. Just after this miraculous happening where the oil lasts, the bread lasts many, many days, not just for the widow and her son, but for Elijah and for her whole household. Just after that, Elijah hears that her son died. I can only imagine that Elijah feels betrayed in that sacred trust. Listen to these next few verses in 1 Kings. "Lord, my God, why have you brought tragedy even on this widow that I am staying with, by causing her son to die?" But Elijah prays to the Lord not just once, not twice, but 3 times. And finally, the son is raised again. He lives. And in that moment, finally, the widow trusts Elijah. Not before when she saw the miracle that the food had lasted, but in this moment of life and death, she says, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth." Now, here's the rub. We are called to do the same. If we proclaim with Elijah and the widow of Zarephath and this woman who gives her 2 copper coins that God is truly the God of all, that means that we too are called to trust God in all things, even in the physical things of our food and sustenance and life and death, even in the financial things of our salary and our checkbook and our IRAs and what we put in trust in the offering plate. Do you see how similar these 2 stories are this morning? The widow of Zarephath and this unnamed woman who gives her 2 copper coins. At first glance, we could maybe think that Jesus is also being coercive here. He's praising her for giving away all that she has to live on. But remember who Jesus is and what Jesus has done. Jesus knows himself what it is to turn over his body and soul into God's arms. Jesus knows himself what it is to trust that God provides all things. God provides a manger when there is no room in the inn. God provides food in the desert when the crowds have come out to see him and there's only 2 fish and 5 loaves. God provides a colt for Jesus to ride into the holy city. And finally, at the very last, God provides even a tomb where Jesus' body is laid. Thankfully, we're not Jesus. We're not called to be Jesus or to be the widow or to be this woman who gives her copper coins. But we are called to look carefully at our resources, to recognize that everything we have is a gift, pure gift. and it's a pure gift to share it with others. At the table at Asbury, there were just enough chairs. But really, though, in the tradition of Elijah, I should have pulled in one more chair. At Jewish Passovers, often they leave a chair open for Elijah, the awaited Messiah, to come back. I like to reinterpret this tradition, though, and pull up one more chair anytime our Bible study has filled up, so that there's always one chair open for somebody who might be coming late, so that we can always welcome someone else as a treasured guest in our midst. How can you leave one chair open this week? How can you be more generous? What's one small thing you can do to welcome others? There's a great analogy that's told sometimes of heaven and hell. This isn't in the Bible, but I find it to be a helpful illustration. Heaven and hell both look exactly the same. They are set out with long tables, filled with the most delicious stew that you can imagine, wafting up. But there's a problem. And the problem is that everyone only has spoons that are 10 feet long, way too long to reach their own mouths. And so though they look the same, they also look very different. In hell, the people are competing. They are starving and wasting away because they can't feed themselves. They start to fight with the spoons that they were meant to feed each other with. But in heaven, they've learned to live in love. And so there's enough for everyone. Everyone flourishes and everyone is fed because they take care of each other instead of themselves. Like Elijah, God has already made room for you at the table. Like the widow of Zarephath and the woman with her 2 coins, God's given you, provided for you everything that you need, and enough to share with others. Thanks be to God, who gives us our bread. Amen.